Kim Il-sung, the Eternal Leader and the Making of North Korea's Dynasty, Part 1, Early Life of Kim Il-sung, Roots, Birth, and Family Background. The man who would one day dominate the political and historical narrative of North Korea as Kim Il-sung was born on the 15th of April, 1912, under the name Kim Song-ju. This birth occurred at a turning point in global history, as the era of empires began to fade into an age of modern nation-states. Kim's birthplace was the modest and unassuming village of Namni, a small, quiet settlement that would, in future decades, become absorbed into the city of Pyongyang, now the capital of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. At the time of Kim's birth, however, the Korean peninsula was a land very different from its modern self. It existed under the colonial rule of Japan, which referred to Korea as Chin, the name given to this territory following its annexation into the Japanese Empire. To understand the significance of Kim Il-sung's upbringing and eventual role in history, it is essential to trace his lineage and the societal currents that shaped his formative years. Central to this storied genealogy was Kim Tae-seo, a notable figure believed to be a descendant of King Gyeong, son of Silla. King Gyeong's son was the final ruler of the Silla dynasty, which had dominated the Korean peninsula during the 7th to 10th centuries. However, despite these illustrious connections to Korea's royal past, the family's fortunes had greatly diminished by the late 19th century, their prestige a mere echo of ancient glory. Kim Il-sung's immediate family embodied a complex blend of Korean tradition and new influences brought about by globalization and colonialism. During the mid-19th century, Korea remained a relatively closed society, holding to its Joseon dynasty traditions. However, as foreign missionaries and merchants began arriving on the Korean peninsula, they brought with them ideas and ideologies that would have profound effects on individuals like Kim Hyong-jik. One of the most prominent groups among these foreigners were Western Christian missionaries, particularly from Protestant denominations. From the 1860s onward, Presbyterian missionaries, primarily Scottish Calvinists, began to establish churches and schools throughout Korea. He converted to Presbyterian Christianity, a decision that marked the family as part of a broader trend among Koreans who sought both spiritual solace and educational opportunities in a rapidly changing and oppressed society. As a result, the Kim family became part of a small yet influential group of Koreans whose lives were shaped by both Confucian traditions and Protestant ethics. This duality, a connection to Korea's ancient heritage and exposure to modern ideas through religion, would deeply influence Kim Song-jae's upbringing. Kim Hyong-jik was not the only significant figure in the young Kim's life. His mother, Kang Pan-suk, also played an instrumental role in shaping his early years. A woman of resilience and strength, Kang Pan-suk supported her husband through their family's struggles, raising their children in an environment where education, faith, and opposition to oppression were central values. The couple would have several children, but their firstborn son, Kim Song-ju, would later eclipse his siblings in historical importance. Two of his younger brothers, Kim Yong-ju and Kim Chul-ju, would go on to play varying roles in Korea's turbulent history, though under far less dramatic circumstances than their elder sibling. Kim Yong-ju, remarkably, lived into the 21st century, passing away in 2021 after having once been considered a potential political successor to Kim Il-sung during the late 1970s. In contrast, Kim Chul-jae's life came to a tragic and untimely end during the Korean resistance against Japanese colonial rule, a harsh and unforgiving struggle that shaped Kim Song-jae's outlook as a young man. The historical context of Kim's birth, a nation in crisis, to fully appreciate the environment into which Kim Song-ju was born, one must consider the broader historical and political context of Korea in the early 20th century. For centuries, the Joseon Kingdom of Korea had been a fiercely independent, Confucian society. Its rulers had chosen to adopt an isolationist stance during the 17th century, largely closing the kingdom's borders to foreign trade and influence. The first encounters with Europeans, particularly the Dutch and Portuguese, had been viewed with suspicion, and Korea sought to maintain its sovereignty by insulating itself from external pressures. This policy of seclusion, however, was destined to crumble by the mid-19th century. The 19th century was an era of imperialism and rapid industrialization, during which technologically advanced powers such as Britain, France, and the United States forced their way into Asian markets. These Western nations, eager to expand their trade networks and assert their dominance, pressured China, Japan, and Korea to open their borders to foreign commerce and ideas. In Japan, this external pressure culminated in the Meiji Restoration of 1868. The Japanese leaders of the Meiji era recognized that embracing Western industrial techniques, military strategies, and governance systems was essential to maintaining their sovereignty and becoming a major power in the Western Pacific. Japan's transformation into an imperialist force was swift and startling. By the 1870s, it had begun to assert its dominance over neighboring Korea. The unequal Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876 was a decisive moment. Korea was coerced into opening its ports to Japanese merchants, thus initiating decades of increasing Japanese control over the peninsula. Over the following decades, Japan's victories in wars against China, 1894 to 1895, and Russia, 1904 to 1905, further solidified its position as the preeminent power in East Asia. Finally, in 1910, Japan formalized its control over Korea through annexation, marking the peninsula as the first significant addition to the Empire of Japan. The annexation brought profound changes to Korean society. The Japanese colonial authorities pursued an aggressive policy of assimilation known as Japanification. Korean culture, language, and traditions were systematically suppressed as the Japanese sought to integrate Korea into their empire as a subordinate territory. Schools taught Japanese history and culture, and speaking the Korean language in public became discouraged or outright forbidden. Meanwhile, Korean landowners saw their property seized, and farmers were subjected to heavy taxes that plunged many into poverty. Part 2. Early childhood and the political awakening of young Kim Song-ju. Kim Song-ju, later to be immortalized as Kim Il-sung, spent his earliest years in a Korea burdened by colonial rule. Born in 1912, just 2 years after Korea's formal annexation by Japan, his childhood was shaped by the deep national trauma felt throughout the peninsula. For centuries, the Korean people had maintained a fiercely independent cultural identity, rooted in Confucian values, strong family ties, and respect for ancestral heritage. However, Japan's oppressive rule brought systematic efforts to strip away this identity. Under these circumstances, young Kim's worldview was forged amidst poverty, repression, and a simmering spirit of resistance. The Kim family, though of distinguished ancestry, struggled economically during Kim Song-jae's early childhood. Like many other Korean families, their fortunes had been decimated under Japanese policies that heavily taxed landowners, reallocated property to Japanese settlers, and restricted economic opportunities for native Koreans. Despite their poverty, education remained a core value within the Kim household. As devout Presbyterians, Kim's parents took advantage of opportunities presented by Christian missionary schools. These schools, often established by Western Protestant missions, served as rare avenues for upward mobility in a society where Koreans were otherwise marginalized. For Kim Song-ju, the teachings in these Christian schools planted seeds of both intellectual curiosity and political awareness. Though the faith and morals imparted in these institutions were rooted in Western Christianity, the underlying message of justice, equality, and resistance to tyranny resonated deeply with a young boy living under colonial oppression. Simultaneously, these schools emphasized literacy and modern education, equipping students with skills that would later be vital for participation in emerging political movements. The March 1 movement of 1919, a turning point in Kim's early life. One event that left an indelible mark on Kim Song-jae's early consciousness was the March 1 movement of 1919. By this time, Kim was just 7 years old, but the events of that year cast a long shadow over his formative years. The March 1st movement was born out of decades of growing resentment among Koreans toward Japanese rule. The colonial government had imposed harsh measures to assimilate Korea into the Japanese Empire, including banning the Korean language from schools, forcing Koreans to adopt Japanese names, and encouraging Japanese settlers to dominate Korean society economically. The immediate catalyst for the March 1st movement was the death of Emperor Gojong, the last true ruler of Korea before Japanese annexation. Gojong had been forced to abdicate in 1907 under Japanese pressure, and his death in January 1919 was widely believed to have been orchestrated, perhaps through poisoning, by Japanese agents. For many Koreans, the emperor's death was the final indignity, a stark reminder of their subjugation. On March 1, 1919, a group of Korean students and intellectuals gathered in Seoul to read the Declaration of Independence, a document that proclaimed Korea's right to self-determination and called for peaceful resistance against Japanese colonial rule. Inspired by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's post-World War I ideals of national self-determination, the movement spread rapidly across the country. Thousands of Koreans, young and old, men and women, took to the streets in protest. The March 1st demonstrations were a moment of extraordinary courage, as Koreans risked their lives to defy a powerful imperial oppressor. However, the Japanese authorities responded with brutal force. Protesters were met with bayonets, rifles, and imprisonment. Estimates suggest that thousands were killed or wounded, and many more were arrested. Entire villages were razed as the Japanese sought to suppress the burgeoning spirit of Korean nationalism. For the Kim family and many others, the March 1st movement was not just a political event but a deeply personal one. Though Kim Song-ju was too young to actively participate, he would have heard the whispers of rebellion and the cries of the wounded echoing through his village. His parents, staunch opponents of Japanese rule, shared the outrage and determination of the Korean people. These events were undoubtedly discussed at the family table, reinforcing Kim's awareness of the injustices suffered by his countrymen. It was within this climate of discontent and resistance that Kim's early ideas about independence, leadership, and revolution began to take root. The legacy of resistance, the Kim family's relocation to Manchuria. By the early 1920s, the Japanese crackdown on Korean descent had grown even harsher. The memory of the March 1st movement lingered as a symbol of hope for some, but it also led to widespread arrests, surveillance, and suppression. The Kim family, already outspoken in their opposition to Japanese rule, found themselves under increasing scrutiny. As a result, many Koreans, including the Kims, were forced to make a difficult choice: remain in their homeland under the yoke of oppression, or leave everything behind and seek refuge elsewhere. In 1920, when Kim Song-ju was just 8 years old, the Kim family made a pivotal decision that would forever alter their lives. They joined a growing exodus of Koreans fleeing the peninsula for the nearby Manchuria region in northeastern China. At the time, Manchuria was a vast, sparsely populated frontier that offered a degree of freedom and opportunity unavailable under Japanese rule. For political exiles, it also served as a haven where resistance movements could take root and grow. The journey to Manchuria was not an easy one. It required traversing difficult terrain, leaving behind family ties and possessions, and adjusting to life in a foreign land. However, for families like the Kims, the move represented both a practical necessity and an act of defiance. Manchuria was a place where they could escape immediate Japanese control and begin building connections with other Korean exiles who shared their nationalist aspirations. Life in Manchuria, a breeding ground for revolution. In Manchuria, the young Kim Song-ju encountered a world that was vibrant with revolutionary fervor. The region had become a melting pot of exiled Koreans, Chinese resistance fighters, and communist agitators. It was a place where ideas about liberation, equality, and armed struggle were debated fiercely. For Kim, this environment would serve as his first true political classroom. Though still a boy, he witnessed firsthand the sacrifices and struggles of those who were committed to freeing Korea from its colonial masters. During this period, Kim's father, Kim Hyong-jik, continued to instill in him a deep sense of patriotism and a commitment to justice. While the elder Kim was not a militant, his religious and moral convictions made him a staunch opponent of Japanese rule. He became involved in underground networks of resistance, often meeting with like-minded Koreans to discuss strategies for opposing their oppressors. Young Kim Song-ju absorbed these lessons, developing a sense of purpose and leadership that would later define his rise to prominence. Part 3: The Down with Imperialism Union and Kim's Early Political Activities. The early 1920s were a formative period for Kim Song-ju, who would later emerge as Kim Il-sung, the future leader of North Korea. Following the Kim family's relocation to Manchuria, the region became both a refuge and a crucible of revolutionary thought. Here, amidst the growing struggles of Koreans in exile, Kim's awareness of colonial oppression, national identity, and the necessity for resistance matured rapidly. Manchuria in the 1920s was far from a peaceful refuge. Though it offered temporary reprieve from direct Japanese control, the region was embroiled in conflicts and economic challenges. It was home to a diverse mix of Chinese warlords, ethnic Korean settlers, Japanese agents, and burgeoning communist groups. For displaced Koreans, life in Manchuria was filled with hardship. Many worked as laborers or farmers under difficult conditions, suffering discrimination and economic exploitation. Nevertheless, it was also a place where nationalist sentiments thrived, and the seeds of armed resistance were being sown. For Kim Song-ju, this environment provided opportunities to engage with political movements far earlier than most of his peers. While the details of Kim's early years in Manchuria are clouded by myth, much of it perpetuated later by North Korean propaganda, several significant events shaped his emerging identity as a revolutionary. The Down with Imperialism Union, Myth and Reality. In 1926, at the age of just 14, Kim Song-ju was said to have founded a revolutionary group known as the Down with Imperialism Union. This narrative, propagated by North Korean state media and detailed in Kim Il-sung's memoirs, With the Century, paints him as a precocious and visionary leader who took a stand against Japanese imperialism from a remarkably young age. The Union, according to these accounts, aimed to liberate Korea from colonial rule and overthrow imperialist forces worldwide. However, objective historical accounts provide a more tempered view. Scholars and historians have cast doubt on the extent of Kim's involvement in founding the Down with Imperialism Union. At just 14 years old, it seems unlikely that Kim possessed the organizational capacity or resources to establish such a group independently. Instead, the creation of the Union is often attributed to R.I. Chongrag, a prominent Korean radical in Manchuria at the time. R.I. and others were actively working to unite exiled Koreans in the region under various anti-Japanese and pro-independence banners. While the Union may not have been entirely Kim's brainchild, his association with the group marks the beginning of his active engagement with political resistance. It is clear that by the mid-1920s, Kim was already deeply involved in revolutionary circles, attending meetings, listening to fiery speeches, and absorbing the ideologies of resistance leaders. The Down with Imperialism Union, whether real or exaggerated in later retellings, symbolized the merging of Kim's personal ambition with the broader nationalist cause that resonated deeply with Koreans across Manchuria. Political education. Kim's years at Yuan Middle School. During the late 1920s, Kim Song-ju attended Yuan Middle School in Jilin Province, located in northeastern China. This period proved to be a critical phase in his political and ideological development. Yuan Middle School was not merely an academic institution, it was a hotbed of political activity. Many of its students and teachers were active in underground resistance groups, including early communist cells, which sought to challenge Japanese imperialism and support the plight of oppressed peoples. At Yuan, Kim was introduced to Marxism-Leninism, the ideology that would come to define much of his life. He began to study the works of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and Vladimir Lenin, gaining an understanding of proletarian revolution and class struggle. For a young Korean living in exile, Marxist ideas offered not only a theoretical framework but also a practical strategy for liberation. Communism, with its emphasis on equality, anti-imperialism, and collective action, seemed to align perfectly with the goals of Korean nationalists fighting Japanese oppression. Kim also witnessed firsthand the profound divisions within Chinese society at the time. China in the 1920s was racked by civil war and political turmoil. The two dominant factions, the Chinese Communist Party (CCP) and the Kuomintang (KMT), or Chinese nationalists, were locked in a bitter struggle for control of the country. While both groups opposed Japanese expansion in China and Manchuria, their methods and ideologies differed greatly. The CCP, in particular, appealed to Kim because of its emphasis on revolutionary struggle and proletarian solidarity. These experiences helped Kim forge connections with Chinese communists and solidify his belief that armed resistance would be the key to freeing Korea. Kim's arrest and early struggles, Kim Song-jae's increasing political involvement did not go unnoticed. By 1929, when he was just 17 years old, Kim was arrested by the Chinese authorities for his involvement in communist activities. This arrest was not an isolated incident but part of a broader crackdown on Korean and Chinese radicals who were seen as a threat to the established order. The experience of imprisonment was harsh and humiliating, but it also served as a rite of passage for the young revolutionary. While imprisoned, Kim had time to reflect on his role in the struggle against Japanese imperialism. Far from breaking his resolve, the experience deepened his commitment to the cause. Upon his release, Kim's reputation among his peers grew. He was now seen as someone who had suffered for the movement, a badge of honor in the eyes of fellow revolutionaries. Emergence as a young leader, by the early 1930s, Kim Song-ju had begun to emerge as a prominent figure within the Korean resistance movement in Manchuria. His youthful energy, charisma, and ability to inspire others set him apart from many of his contemporaries. He delivered passionate speeches about the need for unity among Koreans and the importance of armed struggle against Japan. These speeches resonated with the thousands of exiled Koreans who had suffered under colonial rule and were searching for a leader who could articulate their hopes and frustrations. At the same time, Kim's association with Chinese communists provided him with valuable military training and organizational experience. He learned the tactics of guerrilla warfare, which would later become his hallmark strategy during the Korean resistance. These early lessons in leadership, ideology, and military strategy laid the groundwork for Kim's rise to prominence as a revolutionary commander. Part 4: The Japanese Invasion of Manchuria and Kim's Rise as a Guerrilla Leader. The early 1930s marked a turning point not just in Kim Song-jae's life but in the geopolitical landscape of East Asia. On September 18, 1931, the Japanese Imperial Army launched what became known as the Mukden Incident, a staged event near the city of Shenyang, then called Mukden, in Manchuria. The Japanese used this minor railway explosion as a pretext to invade and occupy the region, a calculated move to expand their control in northern China. Within months, the Japanese established the puppet state of Manchukuo, installing Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, as its nominal head. Behind the facade, however, Manchukuo was governed as an extension of the Japanese Empire, with its resources and people exploited for imperial ambitions. This invasion and occupation had profound consequences for Koreans living in Manchuria. Already displaced from their homeland, many Koreans now found themselves under Japanese oppression once more. This situation radicalized thousands of exiles, who turned to underground resistance movements. For Kim Song-ju, who had spent his youth steeped in anti-imperialist ideology, the Japanese invasion became a catalyst for action. No longer content with speeches and small political gatherings, Kim began his transformation into a guerrilla leader, a figure who would take the fight to the Japanese through direct military confrontation. Kim's early role in the anti-Japanese resistance. By 1932, Kim had joined the Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army, a coalition of Korean and Chinese communists who sought to resist Japanese occupation through guerrilla warfare. This movement drew support from peasants, workers, and exiled intellectuals who viewed armed resistance as the only viable path to liberation. At just 20 years of age, Kim's reputation as a capable and charismatic organizer began to grow within this movement. The nature of guerrilla warfare in Manchuria was harsh and unforgiving. The terrain, rugged mountains, dense forests, and freezing winters, posed immense challenges for resistance fighters. Supplies were scarce, morale was difficult to sustain, and Japanese forces were relentless in their pursuit of insurgents. The Japanese military conducted brutal scorched earth campaigns, burning villages, executing suspected collaborators, and imprisoning thousands in concentration camps to root out resistance networks. Despite these hardships, the anti-Japanese fighters, including Kim and his comrades, adapted to their environment, employing hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and sabotage to harass Japanese forces and disrupt their operations. During this period, Kim began to distinguish himself as a natural leader. While some resistance leaders operated in isolation or relied heavily on Chinese support, Kim emphasized building strong ties with local Korean communities. He visited villages, spoke to farmers and laborers, and inspired them to join the cause or provide vital supplies and intelligence. His ability to connect with ordinary people, combined with his growing military skills, earned him both respect and followers. It was during these years that Kim first began to cultivate the image of a heroic leader, a portrayal that North Korean propaganda would later elevate to near-mythic proportions. The Manchuria incident and the purges of Koreans in Manchuria. Kim's rise as a prominent resistance leader was not without significant challenges. By the mid-1930s, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, which had been Kim's primary ally, became increasingly suspicious of its Korean comrades. These suspicions were rooted in fears that Korean militants operating in Manchuria might be infiltrated by Japanese spies or saboteurs. This period of paranoia culminated in the Manchuria incident, a series of purges conducted between 1933 and 1936, during which many Korean communists were arrested, tortured, and executed under false accusations of collaborating with the Japanese. The Manchuria incident was devastating for the Korean resistance movement. Hundreds of its most experienced leaders were killed, and trust between the CCP and the Koreans was severely eroded. Kim Song-ju, however, managed to survive the purges. Rather than retreating into obscurity, he used this period to further consolidate his leadership among the remaining Korean militants. Archival records suggest that Kim defended his fellow Koreans within the Chinese Communist Party, arguing passionately against the blanket accusations of disloyalty. His ability to navigate this treacherous political landscape and emerge unscathed further cemented his reputation as a leader who could survive against all odds. The emergence of Kim Il-sung, adopting that son of resistance. It was around this time, in 1935, that Kim Song-ju began using the name by which he would be remembered, Kim Il-sung. The name, which translates roughly as Kim become the sun, carried profound symbolic weight. In Korean culture, the sun represents life, light, and leadership, qualities that Kim sought to embody as he rose to prominence in the resistance. The name also marked a deliberate step in shaping his public persona, as he began to position himself not merely as a soldier but as the symbolic leader of the Korean liberation movement. The adoption of this name foreshadowed Kim's growing ambition and his understanding of the power of symbolism in uniting a fragmented resistance under a common cause. Over time, the name Kim Il-sung would come to represent more than just an individual. It would embody the struggle of the Korean people against imperial domination, a narrative that Kim and his successors would amplify in later decades. The Battle of Pochombo, a turning point. By the mid-1930s, Kim Il-sung's reputation as a guerrilla leader had begun to extend beyond Manchuria and into Korea itself. His growing band of fighters, operating alongside Chinese communists, launched small-scale raids on Japanese outposts, transportation lines, and supply depots. These raids, though limited in scope, served a dual purpose. They disrupted Japanese operations and inspired hope among ordinary Koreans, who saw in Kim's efforts a glimpse of resistance against overwhelming odds. A pivotal moment in Kim's rise occurred in 1937 at the Battle of Pochonbo, a raid that would later be mythologized in North Korean history. Kim, leading a detachment of approximately 200 guerrilla fighters, crossed the border into northern Korea and attacked the Japanese-held town of Pochonbo. The raid was meticulously planned and executed. Kim's forces overwhelmed the Japanese garrison, destroyed police stations and administrative buildings, and temporarily seized control of the town. Though the Battle of Pochonbo was small in scale, lasting only a few hours, it had enormous symbolic significance. News of the raid spread quickly, and for the first time in years, Koreans living under Japanese rule saw evidence that armed resistance was not only possible but could also be effective. The attack turned Kim Il-sung into a folk hero among Korean nationalists, and his reputation as both a military tactician and a leader of the resistance grew exponentially. Conclusion: Kim Il-sung's transformation into a resistance icon. The late 1930s solidified Kim Il-sung's role as one of the leading figures in the Korean resistance movement. His combination of guerrilla tactics, charismatic leadership, and ability to adapt to shifting political alliances set him apart from many of his contemporaries. At the same time, the Japanese escalation of hostilities in China and the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 created new opportunities for resistance movements across East Asia. While much of Kim's early activities would later be exaggerated or embellished by North Korean propaganda, there is little doubt that he played a significant role in mobilizing Koreans against Japanese imperialism. His experiences during this period, navigating persecution, building alliances, and leading successful raids, shaped the leader he would become. By the time World War II erupted in 1939, Kim Il-sung had laid the foundation for his eventual emergence as the dominant figure in post-war Korean politics. Part 5: World War II, Soviet Influence, and Kim's Rise to Power in North Korea. As the late 1930s gave way to the 1940s, the East Asian geopolitical landscape entered a new and far bloodier chapter. The Japanese invasion of China in 1937 had escalated into a full-scale war, further entrenching Japanese dominance in Manchuria and northern China. Simultaneously, tensions between Japan and the Soviet Union, which bordered northeastern China and Korea, grew to the breaking point. The expanding war effort intensified Japanese militarization and oppression in Korea, but it also presented new opportunities for resistance movements. During this period, Kim Il-sung, already emerging as a key figure in the Korean anti-Japanese resistance, would further solidify his position, aligning himself with broader Soviet strategic interests. While Japanese forces cracked down on resistance across Manchuria and the Korean peninsula, Kim's ability to survive and adapt set him apart. By the end of World War II, Kim would emerge not only as a guerrilla leader but also as the preferred candidate of the Soviet Union to lead the northern half of a newly liberated Korea. Retreat to Soviet territory, the 88th International Brigade, the Japanese military's brutal counterinsurgency campaigns in Manchuria during the late 1930s decimated many Korean and Chinese resistance groups. Kim Il-sung and his comrades, who had waged guerrilla warfare for nearly a decade, were no exception. The Japanese launched sweeping operations to root out insurgents, using a combination of scorched earth tactics, torture, and mass executions. Resistance forces were forced deeper into remote mountainous areas, struggling to survive. Kim and his remaining fighters found themselves increasingly isolated and outnumbered. By 1940, the Japanese military considered Kim Il-sung one of the most wanted men in East Asia. Posters bearing his image circulated throughout the region, and Japanese forces devoted considerable resources to hunting him down. Recognizing the dire situation, Kim and his guerrilla group made a calculated retreat across the border into the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, had long supported communist revolutionary movements across Asia as a means of countering Japanese imperial ambitions. Kim's relocation to Soviet-controlled territory marked the beginning of a critical new phase in his political and military career. In 1942, Kim and his surviving comrades were incorporated into the Soviet military as part of the 88th International Brigade, a unit composed of Korean and Chinese anti-Japanese fighters. The brigade, stationed in the Soviet Far East near the borders of Manchuria and Korea, served two purposes. It allowed the Soviets to train and organize experienced resistance fighters, and it enabled figures like Kim to forge closer ties with Soviet officials. This period of training in Soviet territory would prove invaluable to Kim, both militarily and politically. Under Soviet guidance, Kim received training in modern warfare tactics, military strategy, and leadership. Soviet officers taught him how to organize troops, plan coordinated attacks, and use advanced weaponry. These skills, coupled with his previous experience in guerrilla warfare, transformed Kim into a formidable military leader. Just as importantly, Kim developed relationships with key Soviet commanders and political figures, relationships that would later play a decisive role in his rise to power. Kim's personal life during the war, marriage and family. Amid the turmoil of war and exile, Kim Il-sung's personal life also entered a new phase. In 1941, he married Kim Jong-suk, a fellow resistance fighter who had been orphaned during the Japanese conquest of Manchuria. Kim Jong-suk was a committed revolutionary in her own right, having joined the anti-Japanese struggle as a teenager in the mid-1930s. According to North Korean state narratives, she once saved Kim's life during an ambush, an event that became part of the carefully constructed mythology surrounding their relationship. Shortly after their marriage, Kim Jong-suk gave birth to the couple's first child, Kim Jong-il, in either 1941 or 1942. The precise details of Kim Jong-il's birth remain shrouded in propaganda and controversy. North Korean accounts claim that he was born on Mount Paektu, a sacred site in Korean mythology, under a double rainbow and amidst the appearance of a bright star in the sky, a narrative intended to underscore his divine and destined leadership. However, other accounts suggest that Kim Jong-il was born in Soviet territory during his parents' time in exile. Regardless of the truth, the mythologizing of Kim's family life began early and would later become a cornerstone of North Korea's cult of personality. The turning tide of World War II. By the early 1940s, the tide of World War II was beginning to turn. Japan, once ascendant across East Asia and the Pacific, now found itself increasingly on the defensive. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the United States into the war, transforming it into a truly global conflict. American victories in the Pacific, coupled with the Soviet Union's growing strength on the Asian mainland, placed enormous pressure on Japan. Although the Soviet Union maintained a non-aggression pact with Japan for much of the war, Stalin had his own designs for the future of East Asia. In particular, the Soviets sought to expand their influence into Manchuria and Korea, regions that had long been contested by Japan, China, and Russia. As the European theater of World War II drew to a close in mid-1945, Stalin turned his attention eastward. On August 8, 1945, just 2 days after the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, the Soviet Union officially declared war on Japan. Within days, the Red Army launched a massive offensive into Manchuria, overwhelming Japanese forces in a lightning-fast campaign. Soviet troops advanced southward toward Korea, quickly securing the northern half of the peninsula. Liberation and division, the birth of a new Korea. The Japanese surrender on August 15, 1945, brought an end to their colonial rule over Korea, a moment that Koreans had long awaited. However, this victory did not lead to immediate unity or independence. Instead, Korea was divided into two spheres of influence. the Soviet Union occupied the northern half of the peninsula, while the United States took control of the southern half. The dividing line was established at the 38th parallel, a decision made hastily by Allied leaders without consulting the Korean people. In the Soviet-occupied North, Joseph Stalin and his advisors began searching for a reliable leader to establish a communist regime. Among the candidates was Kim Il-sung, who had spent the past 5 years building connections with Soviet officials while proving himself as a capable military leader. Kim's time in the 88th International Brigade had positioned him as a trusted ally of the Soviet Union, and his Korean heritage made him an ideal figurehead for the new regime. In September 1945, Kim Il-sung returned to Korea for the first time in decades, not as an exile or a guerrilla fighter, but as a Soviet-backed leader. He arrived in Pyongyang to a hero's welcome, orchestrated in part by the Soviet authorities who sought to present him as the natural leader of the Korean people. His speeches emphasized liberation, independence, and the rebuilding of a strong, unified Korea. For many Koreans in the North, Kim represented hope for a brighter future after decades of suffering under Japanese rule. However, the seeds of division had already been sown. While Kim consolidated power in the Soviet-occupied North, American-backed leaders like Syngman Rhee emerged in the South. The ideological split between communism and capitalism, fueled by the broader Cold War rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States, would soon tear the peninsula apart. Part 6: The establishment of North Korea and Kim Il-sung's rise to absolute power. As the dust settled on World War II and Japanese colonial rule ended, Korea stood at a historic crossroads. The division of the peninsula along the 38th parallel was initially seen as a temporary arrangement to facilitate the withdrawal of Japanese forces and the stabilization of the region. However, the growing ideological rift between the Soviet Union and the United States, now the two dominant powers in the emerging Cold War, ensured that Korea's division would harden into a long-term geopolitical reality. In the north, where Soviet forces had established control, Kim Il-sung was emerging as the central figure in the political reshaping of Korean society. Backed by the Soviet Union, Kim had the advantage of Soviet military and political support as he consolidated his power, eliminating rivals and laying the foundation for what would become the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. Kim Il-sung's return to Korea and Soviet support. When Kim Il-sung returned to Korea in September 1945, he was relatively unknown to the Korean population at large. Having spent most of his life in Manchuria and the Soviet Union, Kim's name carried little weight compared to other nationalist leaders who had remained in Korea during Japanese rule or led prominent exile movements abroad. Figures such as Jo Man-sik, a Korean nationalist with a strong following in Pyongyang, initially posed a challenge to Kim's leadership ambitions. However, the Soviet authorities viewed Kim as an ideal candidate to establish a communist government in northern Korea. His guerrilla warfare experience, his ties to the Soviet Union through the 88th International Brigade, and his ability to mobilize Korean resistance fighters gave him credibility in the eyes of the Soviets. Kim also possessed the charisma and adaptability necessary to rally popular support, even as he faced internal opposition. Upon his arrival, Soviet authorities organized mass rallies and carefully choreographed events to introduce Kim to the public as a hero of the Korean resistance. At a rally in Pyongyang in October 1945, Kim delivered his first major speech to a crowd eager to hear from their supposed liberator. He spoke of independence, rebuilding Korea, and eliminating imperialist influence, rhetoric that resonated deeply with a population still scarred by decades of colonial oppression. However, behind the scenes, Kim and his Soviet backers were working to ensure that rival factions would not challenge his authority. Key nationalist and communist leaders who were unwilling to align with Kim's Soviet-backed vision were either marginalized or eliminated. The Soviets, through their military and political advisors, provided critical support in these efforts, helping Kim organize a political apparatus that would ultimately cement his position as the undisputed leader of Northern Korea. The formation of the Workers' Party of Korea, in the immediate post-war years, the political landscape of Northern Korea was dominated by competing factions, including Korean nationalists, communists loyal to China, and those aligned with the Soviet Union. To consolidate power, Kim Il-sung worked diligently to merge these factions under a single, unified banner. This effort culminated in the establishment of the Workers' Party of North Korea in 1946, a precursor to the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK. The Workers' Party became the vehicle through which Kim would consolidate his authority. Soviet advisors guided Kim in creating a highly centralized party structure modeled after the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Positions of power were filled with Kim's most loyal supporters, while potential rivals were purged or sidelined. The party began implementing land reforms, industrial nationalization, and other measures aligned with Soviet-style socialism. One of Kim's earliest policies, the Land Reform Program of 1946, was particularly popular among the peasantry. Under Japanese colonial rule, large landowners, many of whom collaborated with the Japanese, had controlled much of Korea's arable land. Kim's government confiscated land from these landowners and redistributed it to peasants, earning him widespread support among the rural population. This reform also served a dual purpose. It weakened the influence of Korea's traditional elite, many of whom opposed Kim's leadership, while solidifying his base of support among the working class. At the same time, Kim oversaw the nationalization of industries that had been previously controlled by Japanese corporations. Factories, mines, and transportation networks were brought under state control, aligning Northern Korea's economy with the broader goals of Soviet socialism. These measures, while disruptive, were portrayed as necessary steps toward building a self-reliant, independent Korean state. The division of Korea, South and North take shape. While Kim Il-sung was consolidating his hold on Northern Korea, the political situation in the South was following a very different trajectory. Under American occupation, efforts to establish a democratic government were marred by political instability, ideological conflicts, and violence. The United States supported conservative nationalist leaders, most notably Syngman Rhee, who was staunchly anti-communist and had spent years in exile in the United States. By 1948, the division of Korea had become irreversible. The United States, frustrated by the failure to negotiate a unified Korean government with the Soviet Union, pushed ahead with elections in the South. These elections, boycotted by Northern Korean leaders and many Southern leftists, resulted in the establishment of the Republic of Korea, ROK, on August 15, 1948, with Syngman Rhee as its first president. In response, Kim Il-sung and his Soviet backers organized their own elections in the North on August 25, 1948. These elections were tightly controlled, and Kim's Workers' Party emerged as the dominant force. On September 9, 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, was formally proclaimed, with Kim Il-sung installed as its premier and de facto leader. The creation of the DPRK marked the beginning of Kim's regime and formalized the division of the Korean peninsula into two ideologically opposed states, Communist North Korea and capitalist South Korea. This division, rooted in the geopolitical rivalry of the Cold War, would define Korea's fate for decades to come. Kim Il-sung's early policies, building a totalitarian state, with his authority established, Kim Il-sung moved swiftly to reshape North Korea according to his vision. His regime adopted many features of Soviet-style communism, including centralized economic planning, collectivized agriculture, and state control of industry. Propaganda became a key tool of the state, as Kim began to cultivate a cult of personality around himself. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and posters celebrated Kim as the great leader and the liberator of the Korean people. The years immediately following the creation of the DPRK were marked by efforts to consolidate political control. Kim targeted opponents within the party and broader society, accusing them of counter-revolutionary activities. Rival factions, whether real or perceived, were purged through show trials, imprisonment, and executions. By the early 1950s, Kim had eliminated most of his political rivals and solidified his position as the undisputed leader of North Korea. At the same time, Kim began laying the ideological groundwork for what would become the Juche philosophy, a doctrine of self-reliance that emphasized Korean nationalism and independence from foreign influence. Though Juche would not be fully articulated until the 1950s and 1960s, its roots were visible in Kim's early rhetoric and policies, which stressed national pride and the strength of the Korean people under his leadership. Part 7, The Korean War, Kim Il-sung's Gamble for Unification. By 1949, Kim Il-sung had established himself as the unchallenged leader of North Korea, officially known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. However, the creation of two Koreas, Communist North Korea under Soviet influence and capitalist South Korea under American support, remained, in Kim's eyes, an unacceptable situation. From the outset of his rule, Kim viewed the division of the Korean peninsula as temporary and believed that unification under his leadership was not only possible but inevitable. This belief, combined with the geopolitical realities of the Cold War, led to one of the most devastating conflicts of the 20th century, the Korean War. The war, which began on June 25, 1950, would leave millions dead, reshape the political landscape of East Asia, and set the stage for decades of hostility between the two Koreas. Kim Il-sung's preparations for war. In the months leading up to 1950, Kim Il-sung had grown increasingly confident in his ability to reunify the Korean peninsula by military means. Several factors fueled this belief. First, Kim's regime had successfully built a powerful and disciplined army, the Korean People's Army (KPA), which was equipped and trained with the assistance of Soviet advisors. Many KPA soldiers were battle-hardened veterans of the Chinese Civil War, having fought alongside Chinese Communist forces under Mao Zedong. Their experience in guerrilla warfare and conventional combat made them a formidable force. Second, the political situation in South Korea appeared unstable. Syngman Rhee's government faced significant opposition from leftist groups, labor unions, and student activists, who resented its authoritarian policies and close ties to the United States. Rhee's rhetoric about reunifying the peninsula under his rule mirrored Kim's ambitions, but his administration was plagued by corruption and dissent. To Kim, South Korea's internal division seemed like a vulnerability that could be exploited through a swift military campaign. Most critically, Kim needed the approval of his two main allies, the Soviet Union and China. In early 1950, Kim traveled to Moscow to meet with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, presenting his case for an invasion of South Korea. Stalin, though cautious, eventually gave his approval, provided that Kim could secure additional support from Mao Zedong. Stalin's reasoning was strategic. The Soviet leader believed that the United States would not intervene decisively in Korea, particularly after its withdrawal of significant military forces from the region in 1949. Kim then sought Mao's endorsement, recognizing the importance of Chinese support for any military operation. Mao, newly triumphant after the Chinese Communist Party's victory in the Chinese Civil War, agreed to provide assistance. Thus, with the backing of the Soviet Union and China, Kim Il-sung began preparing for what he believed would be a quick and decisive victory. The outbreak of the Korean War. At 4 a.m. on June 25, 1950, the Korean People's Army launched a massive invasion across the 38th parallel, catching the South Korean forces completely off guard. Kim's strategy was to overwhelm the Republic of Korea Army, ROKA, quickly and capture the capital, Seoul, within days. At the time, the North Korean military had a significant advantage in both manpower and equipment. The KPA's forces numbered approximately 135,000 soldiers, many of whom were well-trained and equipped with Soviet tanks, artillery, and small arms. In contrast, the ROKA had fewer than 100,000 troops, many of whom were poorly trained and inadequately armed. Within 3 days, North Korean forces captured Seoul, achieving the first major objective of Kim's plan. The speed and scale of the North Korean advance shocked both the South Korean government and the international community. Syngman Rhee's government, overwhelmed and in disarray, retreated southward, abandoning the capital. The rapid success of the KPA seemed to confirm Kim Il-sung's belief that South Korea would collapse under the weight of his military offensive. However, he had drastically underestimated the international response. The United States and the United Nations intervene. The invasion of South Korea sent shockwaves through the United States and its Western allies. To American policymakers, the attack on South Korea was seen as a direct challenge to the post-World War II order and a test case for containing communism. President Harry S. Truman, adhering to the principles of the Truman Doctrine, quickly decided to intervene. Within days, the United Nations Security Council, with the Soviet Union absent from proceedings due to a boycott, passed resolutions condemning North Korea's aggression and authorizing military action under the UN banner. By early July 1950, American forces began arriving in Korea, joining the remnants of the South Korean army to form a UN coalition. The arrival of U.S. troops marked a turning point in the conflict, as the superior firepower, logistics, and air support of the American military began to slow the North Korean advance. Despite this, the situation remained dire for South Korea. By August 1950, North Korean forces had pushed the UN and South Korean troops into a small defensive perimeter around Pusan, in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. The Battle of the Pusan perimeter became a crucial moment in the war, as the UN forces, under General Douglas MacArthur, managed to hold their ground and prevent a complete North Korean victory. The turning tide, the Incheon landing, the strategic initiative began to shift dramatically in September 1950, when General MacArthur launched a daring amphibious assault at Incheon, a port city located far behind North Korean lines. The Incheon landing, executed on September 15, caught the North Korean military by surprise and proved to be a decisive blow. UN forces quickly recaptured Seoul and began pushing northward, forcing the KPA into a chaotic retreat. By October 1950, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel into North Korea, with the aim of reunifying the peninsula under South Korean leadership. Kim Il-sung, who had been confident of victory just months earlier, now found himself on the brink of total defeat. Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, fell to UN forces on October 19, and Kim's regime seemed close to collapse. China's intervention saved Kim's regime. Just as Kim's fate appeared sealed, a new player entered the war, China. Alarmed by the rapid advance of UN forces toward its border along the Yalu River, Mao Zedong ordered the intervention of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA. On October 25, 1950, tens of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River, launching a massive counteroffensive against UN forces. The Chinese intervention caught the Americans and their allies off guard. By December, Chinese and North Korean forces had recaptured Pyongyang and pushed UN troops back below the 38th parallel. Seoul fell to Communist forces for the second time on January 4, 1951. The war had devolved into a brutal, back-and-forth struggle that neither side could decisively win. Conclusion of Part 7, Stalemate and the Human Cost. By mid-1951, the Korean War had reached a stalemate. Both sides dug in along the 38th parallel, roughly where the war had begun. For Kim Il-sung, the conflict had exposed the limits of his military ambitions. While his regime survived thanks to Chinese and Soviet intervention, the dream of unifying Korea under his leadership remained unfulfilled. The war's human cost was staggering. Millions of Koreans, soldiers and civilians, were killed, wounded, or displaced. Cities lay in ruins, and the peninsula's economy was devastated. Yet for Kim Il-sung, the conflict solidified his position as North Korea's leader. His regime emerged battered but unbroken, and he would use the war's aftermath to further entrench his authority. Part 8. Post-war Reconstruction and the Cult of Personality, the Korean War, which ended in an armistice on July 27, 1953, left North Korea devastated. Cities like Pyongyang had been reduced to rubble by relentless bombing campaigns, infrastructure was in ruins, and the population faced widespread hunger, homelessness, and dislocation. Yet, in the wake of such destruction, Kim Il-sung emerged stronger than ever. The war, though a failure in achieving his dream of reunification, had solidified his role as the savior of North Korea, a title he would use to build a regime defined by totalitarian control and a near-religious devotion to his leadership. The immediate aftermath of the war, the Korean War officially ended not with a peace treaty but with a ceasefire agreement, leaving the peninsula divided along the demilitarized zone, DMZ, near the 38th parallel. Both North and South Korea remain technically at war, a state of affairs that persists to this day. The years immediately following the armistice were marked by enormous challenges for Kim's government. The economic devastation caused by the war was staggering. Industrial centers had been obliterated, including factories, power plants, and transportation networks. Agriculture was in shambles, leaving the population at risk of starvation. Millions of North Koreans had been killed, injured, or displaced. Despite these challenges, Kim Il-sung portrayed the outcome of the war as a victory for North Korea. Propaganda framed the conflict as a successful defense of Korean sovereignty against imperialist aggression from the United States and its allies. This narrative allowed Kim to rally the population around his leadership and redirect their focus toward rebuilding the nation under his rule. Rebuilding the economy, centralized planning and Soviet aid, Kim Il-sung's strategy for post-war reconstruction was heavily influenced by Soviet-style economic policies. The state took control of all major industries, implementing a centrally planned economy focused on rapid industrialization. Inspired by Stalin's 5-year plans in the Soviet Union, Kim introduced ambitious targets for rebuilding North Korea's infrastructure and achieving economic self-sufficiency. Key priorities of the reconstruction effort included heavy industry, factories, steel plants, and power stations were rebuilt with Soviet and Chinese assistance. Agriculture, farms were collectivized into large-scale cooperatives, where land was managed collectively by groups of peasants. This policy aimed to increase food production while reinforcing state control over the rural population. Infrastructure, new roads, railways, and cities were constructed, often through mass mobilization campaigns that relied on the labor of ordinary citizens. The Soviet Union and China provided critical support during this period, supplying financial aid, machinery, technical expertise, and materials. This assistance helped Kim Il-sung position himself as the architect of North Korea's recovery, reinforcing the image of his leadership as both essential and divinely ordained. The rise of the cult of personality, Kim Il-sung's success in consolidating power during the war paved the way for the cult of personality that would define his rule. From the mid-1950s onward, North Korea's political, social, and cultural systems were increasingly reoriented to glorify Kim as the great leader, a title that became synonymous with his near-absolute authority. The cult of personality was carefully constructed through several key strategies: propaganda and education. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public announcements celebrated Kim's leadership, often portraying him as a godlike figure who had single-handedly led Korea to liberation and survival. School curricula were rewritten to focus on Kim's heroic deeds, with children learning from an early age that he was the savior of the Korean people. State-sanctioned mythology, Kim's biography was embellished to elevate his role in the resistance against Japan and the Korean War. Events like the Battle of Pachombo were exaggerated, and his time in Manchuria and the Soviet Union was rewritten to portray him as a flawless, preordained leader. His family's history was mythologized, particularly his marriage to Kim Jong-suk, who was portrayed as a revolutionary heroine and the mother of Korea. Mass mobilization and symbols. Statues of Kim Il-sung were erected in public squares across North Korea, with citizens required to bow or pay homage to them during state ceremonies. Grand monuments, including the Mansa-D Grand Monument in Pyongyang, symbolized Kim's towering presence over North Korean society. His image adorned every building, classroom, and office, reinforcing his omnipresence. Juche ideology. In the 1950s, Kim began promoting Juche, or the ideology of self-reliance, as the foundation of North Korea's political philosophy. Juche emphasized Korean nationalism, independence from foreign influence, and unwavering loyalty to Kim Il-sung as the embodiment of the nation's will. Though inspired by Marxism-Leninism, Juche took on a uniquely Korean character, blending communism with ultranationalist rhetoric. This combination of propaganda, ideological indoctrination, and public displays of loyalty ensured that Kim Il-sung's image became inseparable from the identity of the North Korean state. Political purges and consolidation of power. To secure his dominance, Kim Il-sung embarked on a series of political purges aimed at eliminating rivals and consolidating his grip on the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK. The August Faction Incident of 1956, in which opponents within the party sought to challenge Kim's leadership. Kim responded with brutal efficiency, purging the party of dissenters and solidifying his authority. Continued surveillance and suppression of perceived counter-revolutionary elements, including intellectuals, former landowners, and those suspected of disloyalty to the regime. Under Kim's rule, labor camps, modeled on the Soviet Gulag system, were established to imprison political enemies and their families. These camps became tools of terror, designed to suppress dissent and instill fear throughout North Korean society. Rebuilding national identity. Kim as the eternal leader. By the early 1960s, Kim Il-sung had successfully rebuilt North Korea's economy to levels that, surprisingly, outpaced South Korea's at the time. Heavy industry flourished, and infrastructure projects symbolized progress under Kim's leadership. The relative success of this period was used to further strengthen the narrative that Kim was the only leader capable of guiding the Korean people. Kim's title of Great Leader evolved into that of the Eternal Leader, reflecting the regime's efforts to position him as a timeless and infallible figure. This idea would be taken to even greater extremes in later decades, as his rule became the foundation for a dynastic system in North Korea. Conclusion of Part 8, a leader entrenched in myth. By the mid-1950s, Kim Il-sung had transformed North Korea into a state defined by his personal authority, ideological indoctrination, and centralized control. The post-war reconstruction provided the platform for his emergence not just as a political leader but as a quasi-religious figure, worshipped by his people through state-mandated loyalty. While North Korea's economic recovery earned Kim some genuine praise during this period, the darker undercurrents of his rule, repression, purges, and a growing cult of personality were already setting the stage for decades of isolation and hardship to come. Part 9, Isolation, Economic Stagnation, and the Path to Juche. By the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, Kim Il-sung had successfully consolidated his control over North Korea, cementing his position as the nation's unchallenged leader. Yet, the very nature of his leadership, rooted in authoritarianism, extreme centralization, and ideological indoctrination, was steering North Korea toward a path of increasing isolation and economic stagnation. While Kim's early post-war policies had spurred initial recovery and growth, the rigid application of Juche, or the doctrine of self-reliance, began to exacerbate the country's economic challenges. Coupled with North Korea's fractured relationships with its allies and growing hostility toward the outside world, Kim's vision of creating a self-sufficient socialist utopia would become an enduring burden for the country. The ideological shift to Juche. In the late 1950s, Kim Il-sung began formalizing the ideology that would define his regime, Juche. The term, which translates roughly to self-reliance or autonomy, became a cornerstone of North Korea's political, economic, and cultural systems. Though initially influenced by Marxism-Leninism, Juche evolved into a uniquely Korean ideology that prioritized national independence, loyalty to Kim Il-sung, and economic self-sufficiency. The central tenets of Juche can be summarized as follows: political independence. North Korea must reject foreign influence and chart its own political course, free from outside interference. Economic self-reliance. The nation must develop an independent, centrally planned economy that does not rely on foreign aid or trade. Military strength. A strong and self-sufficient military is essential to defend the country's sovereignty and independence. Juche was more than just a political philosophy, it became an instrument of control. By framing self-reliance as a matter of national pride and survival, Kim Il-sung justified isolationist policies and portrayed external trade, foreign influence, and international cooperation as threats to North Korea's independence. This allowed the regime to consolidate power, stifle dissent, and demand unwavering loyalty from the population. Economic stagnation and the costs of self-reliance. The practical application of Juche proved far more problematic than its ideological appeal. While the 1950s and early 1960s saw notable economic growth in North Korea, fueled largely by Soviet aid, Chinese support, and centralized planning, this progress began to falter as Kim pushed for greater self-sufficiency. Overinvestment in heavy industry. Kim's economic policies prioritized heavy industry, such as steel production, mining, and manufacturing, at the expense of agriculture and consumer goods. While this approach initially produced impressive short-term results, it lacked balance. By neglecting agriculture and essential goods, North Korea struggled to meet the basic needs of its population. Collectivization of agriculture. Kim expanded the collectivization of farms, forcing peasants to work on large state-run cooperatives. While collectivization was presented as a way to increase food production, it often led to inefficiency, mismanagement, and declining crop yields. North Korea's harsh winters and limited arable land compounded these issues, creating chronic food shortages. Isolation from global trade. Juche's emphasis on self-reliance led to policies that minimized North Korea's engagement in international trade. While the Soviet Union and China continued to provide support, North Korea's refusal to participate in global markets limited its access to advanced technology, goods, and investment. By the mid-1960s, the cracks in North Korea's economic system were becoming clear. Despite massive state propaganda campaigns celebrating industrial achievements and self-reliance, the country's economic growth began to stagnate, while inefficiencies and shortages became more pronounced. In comparison, South Korea, under the leadership of Park Chung-hee, had begun its own economic transformation, adopting policies that prioritized industrialization, foreign investment, and export-driven growth. North Korea's growing isolation. As the Cold War intensified, North Korea found itself increasingly isolated, both politically and ideologically. Although Kim Il-sung had once enjoyed strong relationships with both the Soviet Union and China, his insistence on Juche and his refusal to align fully with either power caused tensions to grow. Sino-Soviet split. By the early 1960s, the ideological rift between the Soviet Union and China, known as the Sino-Soviet split, had deepened. The Soviets, under Nikita Khrushchev, began moving away from the rigid policies of Stalinism, advocating for a more moderate and cooperative approach to global communism. Meanwhile, China, under Mao Zedong, rejected these reforms and adhered to a more radical revolutionary stance. Kim Il-sung sought to navigate this divide by maintaining relationships with both nations. However, his attempts to balance these alliances strained North Korea's ties with both powers. The Soviets began reducing economic aid, while China, particularly during its Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, grew distrustful of Kim's regime. Suspicion of foreign influence. Kim's commitment to Juche further isolated North Korea. Foreign diplomats, cultural exchanges, and even technical assistance were viewed with suspicion, as the regime feared that outside influences might undermine its control. Borders were tightly sealed, and propaganda reinforced the idea that North Korea stood alone as a beacon of independence in a hostile world. The cult of personality reaches new heights. As North Korea became increasingly isolated, Kim Il-sung doubled down on efforts to consolidate his rule through an ever-expanding cult of personality. By the mid-1960s, Kim's image had permeated every aspect of North Korean life. Statues and portraits, massive statues of Kim Il-sung were erected in public squares, while his portraits adorned homes, schools, and workplaces. Citizens were required to maintain and clean these images as acts of loyalty. State propaganda, films, books, and newspapers celebrated Kim as the great leader who had liberated Korea, defended it from imperialism, and guided it toward a glorious future. His leadership was portrayed as infallible and divinely ordained. Mandatory loyalty rituals. Citizens were expected to participate in public demonstrations of loyalty, such as mass rallies, choreographed performances, and ideological study sessions that focused on Kim's teachings. Kim's regime also promoted historical myths that depicted him as a revolutionary hero whose leadership had been central to Korea's resistance against Japanese imperialism. Events such as the Battle of Pachombo were celebrated as defining moments of his military brilliance, while his years in exile were rewritten to emphasize his leadership and sacrifice. Preparing for dynastic rule, by the late 1960s, Kim Il-sung began laying the groundwork for what would become a dynastic succession, a unique development in the communist world. Unlike other Marxist-Leninist states, where leadership transitions were theoretically based on collective decision-making, Kim sought to ensure that power would remain within his family. His eldest son, Kim Jong-il, was quietly groomed as his successor, though this process would not become public until the 1970s. This move reflected Kim's desire to solidify his family's dominance over North Korea and perpetuate the cult of personality he had built. The transition from a revolutionary regime to a hereditary dictatorship would become one of Kim Il-sung's most enduring legacies. Conclusion of Part 9: Isolation and the Path Ahead. By the end of the 1960s, Kim Il-sung's North Korea had become an isolated, highly controlled state defined by the principles of Juche, economic stagnation, and the overwhelming dominance of its leader. While Kim's propaganda machine continued to portray the country as a beacon of independence and self-sufficiency, the realities of food shortages, inefficiencies, and growing isolation were beginning to take their toll. The foundations of modern North Korea, totalitarian control, economic autarky, and the cult of Kim Il-sung, had been firmly established. Yet, these very systems would also lay the groundwork for the economic crises and hardships that North Korea would face in the decades to come. Part 10: The 1970s, Kim Il-sung as president and the shaping of a dynasty. By the dawn of the 1970s, Kim Il-sung had firmly established himself as the undisputed leader of North Korea. His regime, built upon the foundations of Juche ideology, totalitarian control, and an all-encompassing cult of personality, now entered a new phase, the formalization of North Korea as a dynastic state under Kim's rule. Politically, economically, and culturally, every element of life in North Korea became further aligned with Kim's vision, even as cracks began to emerge beneath the surface. The 1970s also marked a period of international ambition for Kim, as North Korea sought recognition on the global stage and aligned itself with other socialist and post-colonial nations. Meanwhile, at home, Kim's consolidation of power reached new heights, solidifying the Kim family as the axis around which North Korean society revolved. The 1972 Constitution and Kim Il-sung as president. A significant milestone in Kim Il-sung's regime came with the promulgation of North Korea's Socialist Constitution on December 27, 1972. This new constitution formalized many of the policies and structures that had already been implemented under Kim's leadership. More importantly, it elevated Kim to an even higher position within the North Korean state by creating the office of President of the DPRK. Key features of the 1972 Constitution included Kim Il-sung's role as supreme leader. The constitution enshrined Kim as the great leader and the president of North Korea, granting him virtually unlimited powers as head of state, head of the military, and leader of the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK. Juche as state ideology. Juche was officially codified as the guiding principle of the North Korean state, emphasizing self-reliance, nationalism, and loyalty to Kim. Centralized control. The constitution formalized the structure of a one-party state, where all political and economic power was concentrated in the hands of Kim and his inner circle. Symbolic rights. The document spoke of universal education, equality, and human rights, but these were purely rhetorical, serving to reinforce the image of Kim's government as benevolent and progressive. Kim's transition from premier to president was accompanied by an intensified focus on his leadership as the central element of North Korea's identity. His speeches, writings, and supposed accomplishments were compiled into volumes of Kim Il-sung works, which became mandatory reading for all citizens. Statues, murals, and portraits of Kim proliferated across the country, and his image became inseparable from the very concept of the North Korean state. The Juche Tower, a monument to self-reliance, in 1982, to mark Kim Il-sung's 70th birthday, North Korea unveiled the Juche Tower in Pyongyang, a monumental symbol of the Juche ideology. Standing 170 meters tall, the tower dominates the skyline of the capital and serves as a constant reminder of Kim's leadership and his vision for self-reliance. The tower's construction reinforced the notion that Kim was not merely a political leader but the architect of North Korea's ideological foundation. Beneath the surface, however, the contradictions of Juche were becoming more apparent. While Kim preached self-reliance, North Korea remained heavily dependent on economic aid and trade with the Soviet Union and China. Kim's refusal to engage meaningfully with the global economy placed an increasing strain on the country's resources, leading to inefficiencies and stagnation. International ambitions and alliances. The 1970s also saw Kim Il-sung pursue a more assertive foreign policy as North Korea sought to expand its influence and secure allies among newly independent nations in the developing world. Kim positioned North Korea as a model of socialist self-reliance, offering technical assistance, military training, and economic aid to countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Key developments during this period included relations with post-colonial nations. North Korea built ties with nations such as Egypt, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Angola, presenting itself as a champion of anti-imperialism and decolonization. Kim developed a particularly close relationship with Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, supplying arms and support during the Arab-Israeli conflict. Solidarity with socialist states. While relations with the Soviet Union and China remained tense due to Kim's insistence on Juche, North Korea continued to maintain alliances with other socialist countries, including Cuba under Fidel Castro and Romania under Nicolae Ceausescu. Global propaganda. North Korea engaged in extensive propaganda efforts abroad, promoting Kim Il-sung as a visionary leader and the DPRK as a model for other nations to emulate. These efforts often masked the country's economic challenges and human rights abuses. While Kim's international ambitions brought North Korea temporary prestige among like-minded regimes, they also drained resources that could have been used to address domestic problems. North Korea's financial and military aid to foreign allies often exceeded its means, deepening the strain on its economy. Preparing for succession. The rise of Kim Jong-il. By the late 1970s, Kim Il-sung began preparing for the next phase of his leadership, the transfer of power to his eldest son, Kim Jong-il. Unlike in other communist states, where leadership transitions were theoretically based on collective decisions by party elites, Kim sought to establish a hereditary succession that would ensure his family's control over the country. Kim Jong-il's rise was carefully orchestrated over many years. He was given senior positions within the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK, and became responsible for overseeing propaganda, cultural affairs, and the security apparatus. State propaganda began promoting Kim Jong-il as the dear leader, a title that emphasized his connection to Kim Il-sung while preparing the population to accept him as the natural heir. Kim Jong-il was credited with major cultural and ideological achievements, including the development of the monolithic ideological system, which demanded absolute loyalty to the Kim family. The emergence of Kim Jong-il as the successor marked the formal beginning of the Kim dynasty, a unique phenomenon in the communist world. While North Korea remained nominally a socialist state, it was increasingly governed as a family dictatorship, with power concentrated entirely within the Kim lineage. Conclusion of Part 10, The Shaping of a Dynasty. By the end of the 1970s, Kim Il-sung had transformed North Korea into a state that was not only defined by his leadership but entirely dependent on it. Through the 1972 constitution, the expansion of Juche, and the cultivation of a vast cult of personality, Kim had entrenched himself as the unassailable leader of the country. At the same time, the foundations of the Kim dynasty were being laid, as Kim Jong-il emerged as the heir to his father's rule. This dynastic transition, unprecedented in the communist world, ensured that Kim Il-sung's legacy would endure long after his death. Yet, beneath the facade of ideological purity and state control, North Korea's economic and political vulnerabilities were becoming more apparent. The challenges of the 1980s, economic stagnation, increased isolation, and the growing cult of the Kim family, would set the stage for the most tumultuous period in North Korea's modern history. Part 11, The 1980s, Economic Struggles and Kim Il-sung's Final Years. By the dawn of the 1980s, Kim Il-sung had ruled North Korea for over 3 decades. He stood at the helm of a nation whose very identity had been shaped in his image. North Korea was now fully entrenched in the grip of the Juche ideology, while the cult of personality surrounding Kim continued to grow to near-messianic proportions. However, beneath the veneer of ideological purity and stability, significant cracks were emerging in North Korea's economic and geopolitical landscape. The global political shifts of the 1980s, including rising tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, coupled with China's pivot toward market-oriented reforms under Deng Xiaoping, placed Kim Il-sung in an increasingly precarious position. His refusal to adapt or compromise left North Korea isolated and unprepared for the challenges that lay ahead. Economic stagnation and mismanagement. Throughout the 1980s, North Korea's economic stagnation deepened. The initial gains made during the 1950s and 1960s had long since evaporated, and the country's centrally planned economy was now plagued by inefficiency, corruption, and poor management. Kim's emphasis on heavy industry and military spending continued to divert resources away from agriculture, consumer goods, and infrastructure development. Key factors contributing to the economic decline included over-reliance on foreign aid. Despite the rhetoric of self-reliance, North Korea remained dependent on economic and technical aid from the Soviet Union and China. However, by the 1980s, both nations began reducing their support. The Soviet Union, under Leonid Brezhnev and later Mikhail Gorbachev, shifted its focus to internal reforms, while China moved toward economic liberalization. Lack of modernization. Kim's commitment to Juche discouraged technological and industrial innovation. Factories and infrastructure fell into disrepair, while outdated Soviet-era equipment became increasingly inefficient. Unlike South Korea, which embraced foreign investment and modernization, North Korea lagged behind. Agricultural failures. Collectivized farming, combined with North Korea's limited arable land, resulted in persistent food shortages. Agricultural productivity stagnated, and the government's efforts to mask the problem through propaganda left many citizens undernourished and vulnerable. Excessive military spending. North Korea maintained one of the largest standing armies in the world relative to its population, pouring enormous resources into building a military-industrial complex. While this bolstered Kim's image as the defender of Korean independence, it drained the economy of much-needed resources. By the mid-1980s, it had become clear that North Korea was falling further behind its southern neighbor. South Korea, under the leadership of President Chun Doo-hwan and subsequent administrations, had emerged as an economic powerhouse, driven by industrial exports, foreign investment, and technological innovation. The growing disparity between the two Koreas stood in stark contrast to Kim's propaganda, which continued to depict North Korea as a model of socialist success. International isolation, North Korea, and the changing Cold War. On the international stage, the 1980s were a period of profound change that left North Korea increasingly isolated. Kim Il-sung's regime, once buoyed by support from the Soviet Union and China, found itself adrift as its traditional allies pursued new priorities. Soviet reforms under Gorbachev. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union and introduced a series of reforms known as perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, political openness. Gorbachev's policies represented a direct challenge to Kim's rigid, authoritarian model. More importantly, the Soviet Union began reducing its economic and military aid to North Korea, prioritizing its own domestic recovery. Kim Il-sung viewed Gorbachev's reforms with suspicion, fearing that such changes might undermine his authority. North Korean propaganda vilified the Soviet Union's newfound openness, and relations between Pyongyang and Moscow grew increasingly strained. China's economic reforms. Under Deng Xiaoping, China embraced market-oriented reforms that transformed its economy. By the 1980s, China was opening its doors to foreign investment and pursuing policies that prioritized economic growth over ideological purity. Kim Il-sung, however, rejected these reforms, viewing them as a betrayal of socialist principles. Relations with China remained cordial but cool, as North Korea distanced itself from its once close ally. Limited alliances with developing nations. While North Korea sought to maintain relationships with socialist and post-colonial nations, its ability to provide meaningful economic or military support was increasingly limited. Kim's efforts to position North Korea as a leader of the non-aligned movement brought limited success, but did little to address the regime's isolation. Escalation of the cult of personality. As economic and diplomatic challenges mounted, Kim Il-sung intensified his efforts to maintain control through the cult of personality. The state's portrayal of Kim as the great leader reached new heights in the 1980s, as propaganda emphasized his infallibility and his central role in North Korea's survival. Citizens were required to memorize Kim's speeches, study his writings, and participate in mass rallies celebrating his leadership. Statues, portraits, and monuments dedicated to Kim proliferated further, with every town and village expected to display symbols of his rule. Songs, poems, and theatrical productions glorified Kim's accomplishments, blending propaganda with art to reinforce his divine status. This period also saw the further elevation of Kim Jong-il as Kim Il-sung's successor. By the late 1980s, Kim Jong-il had taken on greater responsibilities within the Workers' Party of Korea, overseeing propaganda, security, and cultural affairs. His rise was carefully orchestrated to present him as the dear leader, the natural heir to his father's legacy. The Rungrado 1st of May Stadium, a monument to grandeur, one of the most ambitious projects of the 1980s, was the construction of the Rungrado 1st of May Stadium in Pyongyang. Completed in 1989, the stadium was built to showcase North Korea's grandeur and ambition. With a capacity of 150,000 spectators, it remains the largest stadium in the world to this day. The stadium's construction was part of Kim's efforts to portray North Korea as a powerful and successful nation, capable of grand achievements despite its economic struggles. It was also used for mass propaganda events, including the Arirang Festival, where tens of thousands of performers participated in elaborate displays celebrating Kim's leadership and the achievements of the DPRK. The twilight of Kim Il-sung's rule. By the late 1980s, Kim Il-sung was approaching his late 70s, and his once dominant regime faced growing challenges. The economic stagnation, coupled with North Korea's isolation from the changing global order, created mounting hardships for ordinary citizens. Food shortages became more frequent, infrastructure crumbled, and the disparity between North and South Korea became impossible to ignore. At the same time, Kim remained outwardly confident and unyielding. He continued to project an image of strength and stability, dismissing calls for reform and blaming North Korea's struggles on foreign aggression and imperialist plots. His speeches called for unwavering loyalty to the state and to Juche, even as the country's foundations began to weaken. Conclusion of Part 11, The Calm Before the Storm. The 1980s marked the final full decade of Kim Il-sung's rule, a period characterized by economic decline, international isolation, and an ever-intensifying cult of personality. While North Korea's challenges were growing, Kim's grip on power remained firm, thanks to the totalitarian systems he had spent decades building. As the world entered the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War would deliver a final, devastating blow to North Korea's economy. Kim Il-sung, though nearing the end of his life, would oversee one of the most difficult periods in North Korea's history. Part 12, The Collapse of the Soviet Union and Kim Il-sung's Final Years. By the dawn of the 1990s, North Korea, under Kim Il-sung's leadership, faced an unprecedented crisis. For decades, Kim had maintained his regime's stability through Soviet aid, Chinese support, and the ideological framework of Juche. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the broader dissolution of communist regimes across Eastern Europe sent shockwaves through the global political order. For North Korea, it marked the beginning of an era of economic catastrophe, deepening isolation, and mounting hardships for its people. As Kim Il-sung entered the final years of his life, his leadership was defined by a desperate struggle to hold on to power, maintain the cult of personality, and ensure a smooth dynastic succession to his son, Kim Jong-il. These efforts came against the backdrop of a world that was rapidly changing and leaving North Korea behind. The collapse of the Soviet Union. North Korea loses its lifeline. The Soviet Union had been North Korea's most critical economic and political ally since the end of World War II. For decades, the Soviets had provided North Korea with economic aid, technical expertise, and trade subsidies, all of which propped up Kim's centrally planned economy. However, under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union pursued policies of glasnost, political openness, and perestroika, economic restructuring, in an effort to modernize and liberalize its society. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was in a state of political and economic collapse. Gorbachev's reforms inadvertently led to the unraveling of the communist bloc, as satellite states in Eastern Europe rejected Soviet influence and embraced democratic reforms. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, marking the end of the Cold War. For North Korea, the consequences were devastating. Loss of economic aid, Soviet financial assistance, which had long sustained North Korea's economy, evaporated almost overnight. Subsidized fuel, machinery, and food imports were cut off, leaving North Korea unable to maintain its industries or feed its population. Trade disruption. With the collapse of the Soviet bloc, North Korea lost access to its primary trading partners. The country's rigid economic system, focused on heavy industry and military production, was ill-suited to adapt to this sudden isolation. Diplomatic isolation. The end of the Cold War reshaped global alliances. Russia, now led by Boris Yeltsin, sought closer ties with the United States and other Western powers, leaving North Korea without its traditional ally. Kim Il-sung refused to acknowledge the need for reform. While other socialist states in Asia, such as China and Vietnam, embraced market-oriented policies to modernize their economies, Kim clung to the ideals of Juche and centralized planning. State propaganda continued to insist that North Korea was thriving under Kim's leadership, even as the country descended into economic chaos. Mounting economic crisis and famine. The collapse of Soviet support left North Korea unable to meet even the most basic needs of its people. The agricultural sector, which had already struggled under collectivization policies, fell into a state of crisis. Several factors contributed to this growing catastrophe. Lack of resources. Without subsidized fuel and machinery from the Soviet Union, North Korea's agricultural output plummeted. Farmers lacked the tools, fertilizers, and fuel needed to produce sufficient crops. Natural disasters. The situation was worsened by a series of floods and droughts in the early 1990s, which devastated farmland and further reduced food supplies. Mismanagement and priorities. Despite the growing food crisis, Kim's regime continued to prioritize military spending and grandiose infrastructure projects over the needs of ordinary citizens. By the mid-1990s, this economic collapse would culminate in a catastrophic famine, known as the Arduous March, that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of North Koreans. While the famine occurred primarily after Kim Il-sung's death, its roots lay in the economic policies and isolationist strategies of his regime during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Kim Il-sung's focus on succession. As the world changed and North Korea's challenges mounted, Kim Il-sung turned his attention to securing the dynastic succession of his son, Kim Jong-il. Unlike in other communist states, where leadership transitions were framed as collective decisions, Kim sought to establish his family as a hereditary ruling dynasty, an unprecedented development in a Marxist-Leninist system. By the early 1990s, Kim Jong-il had already been groomed for leadership for more than a decade. His rise was carefully managed through propaganda that emphasized his loyalty to his father and his contributions to the state. He was portrayed as the dear leader, second only to Kim Il-sung, the great leader. To ensure a smooth transition, Kim Il-sung gradually transferred responsibilities to his son, particularly in the areas of military oversight and internal security. This process was accompanied by an intensified cult of personality around both leaders, reinforcing the idea that the Kim family was uniquely destined to lead the Korean people. Attempts at diplomacy, seeking survival. In his final years, Kim Il-sung made limited attempts to engage with the outside world, recognizing the need for diplomatic flexibility as North Korea's isolation deepened. Negotiations with the United States. In the early 1990s, North Korea's burgeoning nuclear program became a focal point of international concern. The United States, under President Bill Clinton, engaged in negotiations with Pyongyang to address the issue. Kim Il-sung's regime viewed its nuclear program as both a deterrent against external threats and a bargaining chip for securing economic concessions. Relations with South Korea. In a rare moment of thaw, Kim Il-sung expressed willingness to engage in talks with South Korea. Plans were underway for a historic inter-Korean summit aimed at reducing tensions and exploring possibilities for cooperation. These efforts, however, were cut short by Kim's sudden death in 1994. Kim Il-sung's death and legacy. On July 8, 1994, Kim Il-sung suffered a fatal heart attack at his country retreat near Pyongyang. He died at the age of 82, bringing an end to his decades-long rule over North Korea. His death was met with orchestrated displays of grief across the country, as state propaganda portrayed him as the eternal father of the Korean people. Kim's body was preserved and enshrined in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, a massive mausoleum in Pyongyang that had originally been constructed as his official residence. Today, the palace stands as a symbol of his enduring cult of personality, with citizens required to pay homage to their eternal president. Conclusion of Part 12, Kim Il-sung's final years. Kim Il-sung's death marked the end of an era, but his legacy would live on through the system he created. North Korea remained a state defined by isolation, economic hardship, and a relentless cult of personality. Kim's son, Kim Jong-il, inherited a nation on the brink of collapse, with the challenges of famine, economic failure, and international isolation looming large. While Kim Il-sung is remembered as a revolutionary leader by North Korean propaganda, the reality of his rule is far darker. His policies set the stage for decades of suffering, his refusal to reform left the economy in ruins, and his obsession with power created a system that prioritized loyalty to the Kim dynasty over the well-being of the people. Part 13, The Legacy of Kim Il-sung and the Transition to Kim Jong-il. The death of Kim Il-sung on July 8, 1994, marked a profound turning point for North Korea. Though his physical presence was gone, his legacy and the system he created ensured that his influence would endure for decades to come. His son, Kim Jong-il, inherited a country on the brink of collapse, yet the regime itself, built upon a foundation of ideological indoctrination, brutal authoritarianism, and an unrelenting cult of personality, remained intact. Kim Il-sung's passing did not bring about change or reform, as some had hoped. Instead, North Korea's political, economic, and social structures became even more entrenched under the leadership of his successors. This part examines Kim Il-sung's long-term legacy, the immediate impact of his death, and the transition to his son, Kim Jong-il. Eternal President, the deification of Kim Il-sung. One of Kim Il-sung's most striking legacies was the deification of his image after death. In a move that solidified the Kim family's permanent hold on power, Kim was posthumously declared Eternal President of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. No other leader would ever hold the title of president, ensuring that Kim Il-sung's authority remained eternal in both name and practice. This decision was deeply symbolic. It reinforced the quasi-religious cult surrounding Kim Il-sung, elevating him to a godlike figure whose guidance transcended death. It allowed the regime to justify the hereditary succession to Kim Jong-il, framing it as the continuation of Kim Il-sung's eternal leadership. Citizens were encouraged, if not required, to view Kim Il-sung as the father of the nation, whose wisdom and sacrifice guided North Korea through its most challenging periods. Kim's preserved body was placed in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, now a massive mausoleum and pilgrimage site. Citizens were required to visit the palace to pay respects to their great leader, and his image continued to dominate every aspect of public life. Statues, murals, and portraits of Kim remained omnipresent, while his speeches and writings were treated as sacred texts to be studied and revered. Kim Jong-il's rise, a carefully orchestrated transition. The transition from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il was the first dynastic succession in a Marxist-Leninist state, an unprecedented development that underscored North Korea's uniqueness in the communist world. Kim Jong-il's rise to power had been carefully prepared over 2 decades, with his father ensuring that the transfer of authority would be seamless. Key steps in Kim Jong-il's grooming for leadership included consolidation of power. By the late 1970s, Kim Jong-il had been placed in charge of propaganda, the military, and internal security. His rise was depicted as both natural and inevitable, with state propaganda promoting him as the dear leader and the chosen successor. Cult of personality. The cult of Kim Il-sung was extended to include Kim Jong-il, who was portrayed as his father's loyal and capable heir. Stories and myths about Kim Jong-il's birth and achievements were carefully crafted to reinforce his legitimacy. Ideological continuity. Kim Jong-il embraced his father's policies, particularly Juche and the emphasis on self-reliance. This ensured that his leadership was seen as a continuation of Kim Il-sung's eternal guidance. Upon Kim Il-sung's death, Kim Jong-il assumed de facto control of the country. While he did not immediately take on the title of president, out of respect for his father's eternal position, he wielded absolute authority as the chairman of the National Defense Commission, the supreme military body in North Korea. The crisis of the 1990s, famine and isolation. Kim Jong-il inherited a country in crisis. Kim Il-sung's rigid policies and refusal to adapt had left North Korea ill-prepared for the economic shocks of the post-Cold War world. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the reduction of Chinese support exacerbated the country's economic decline, while Kim Il-sung's emphasis on military spending had drained resources away from essential sectors like agriculture and infrastructure. In the mid-1990s, North Korea was plunged into a devastating famine known as the Arduous March. The famine, which began during Kim Il-sung's final years, reached catastrophic levels under Kim Jong-il's rule. Key factors included Agricultural collapse, collectivized farming, outdated equipment, and natural disasters, such as floods and droughts, resulted in widespread crop failures. Economic isolation. Without access to foreign aid or trade, North Korea was unable to import food or resources to address the crisis. Government mismanagement. The regime prioritized military programs and elite survival over the needs of ordinary citizens, exacerbating the suffering of the population. Estimates suggest that between 500,000 and 3 million people died as a result of the famine. While Kim Il-sung's death shielded him from direct blame, the policies he implemented, particularly the emphasis on self-reliance and isolation, were central to the crisis. Kim Il-sung's legacy. A nation shaped in his image, Kim Il-sung's rule left a profound and enduring impact on North Korea, shaping every aspect of the country's political, economic, and cultural systems. His legacy can be summarized as follows. The cult of personality. Kim Il-sung's leadership created one of the most pervasive and enduring cults of personality in modern history. His image became synonymous with the state itself, and his deification ensured his eternal authority over North Korea. The Juche ideology. Kim's emphasis on self-reliance became the cornerstone of North Korea's identity, guiding its policies even as the country descended into isolation and hardship. Totalitarian control. Kim established a system of absolute control, characterized by surveillance, propaganda, and political repression. Dissent was brutally suppressed, and loyalty to the regime was enforced at all levels of society. Economic failure. While Kim oversaw initial periods of economic growth, his policies ultimately led to stagnation, inefficiency, and collapse. The focus on heavy industry and military spending came at the expense of agriculture and consumer welfare. The Kim dynasty. Kim Il-sung's greatest legacy was the establishment of a hereditary dictatorship. By passing power to his son, Kim Jong-il, he ensured that the Kim family would remain at the center of North Korean politics for generations to come. Conclusion. Kim Il-sung's death in 1994 marked the end of one of the longest and most consequential dictatorships of the 20th century. His rule shaped North Korea into a nation defined by isolation, authoritarian control, and a deeply entrenched cult of personality. While his propaganda machine painted him as the great leader and savior of the Korean people, the reality of his leadership was far darker. A reign marked by economic mismanagement, brutal repression, and policies that brought immense suffering to his people. The transition to Kim Jong-il ensured that Kim Il-sung's system would endure. North Korea remained a totalitarian state, guided by Juche and the legacy of its founding leader. The challenges of famine, economic collapse, and international isolation that followed were direct consequences of Kim Il-sung's refusal to adapt or reform. Even today, Kim Il-sung's shadow looms large over North Korea. His name, image, and ideology continue to define the country, perpetuated by his descendants and the system he created. For better or worse, Kim Il-sung remains the single most significant figure in the history of modern Korea, a leader whose impact will be felt for generations to come.